Hello and welcome to episode 407 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perriton, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my good friend, retired Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. Bill, you see what happens if I go off track just one time? I stumble over my own
Yeah,
words and I can't remember who the hell you are.
it's okay. I can't remember who I am either. And I'll tell you, most of the time I feel really good. Today I'm feeling every one of my 67 years, Seth. Um,
Yeah.
hey, before we jump into it today,
Yeah.
I do want to say something because we're going to continue in what I've jokingly, that's not so funny though, referred to as our atrocities series of episodes today. And Seth will tell you what the topic is in a moment. But these have been some pretty brutal conversations we've been having. They're important to have them, and they're important not to filter or water them down. It's important to know what the heck happened in World War II. And yet, YouTube is giving us troubles, still giving us troubles. So it's still putting age restrictions. We try to use alternate language, different words without watering down what it is what actually happened, because the history is important. As we say all the time, if you don't learn from it, it's just talk. But YouTube is likely to put an age restriction on today's episode too, Seth, I think, anyway.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I'm sure they will, and I'm sure this won't be the last one either. It's very disappointing and it's very troubling, frankly. You know, we go out of our way to, and not just us. I mean, I know there's other podcasts that do the same, but I'm speaking from
Mhm.
our personal experience here is we go to great lengths to tell the real story, the accurate story. You know, we've made a few mistakes here and there, but by and large, 99.9% of what we say is accurate, and we say it in a way that people can digest and understand. As you always say, Bill, two guys talking in a bar, and
Mhm.
apparently Google or YouTube or whatever doesn't like some of the things we've said, so they flagged it, which I think is both disgusting and sad. State of American history as it stands, but we're still going to put the material out there, and if they flag it, tough noogies, as they say, because we're still going to get the material out there and y'all can watch it if you want to. And if YouTube flags it, well, then, oh well, but we're still going to bring it to you.
Yeah,
So, because we feel it's important.
it's it's a whole lot tamer than what you would find on Netflix, ironically. And, of course, Netflix puts a rating on it, I guess. Maybe that's what YouTube is trying to do. I'll give them benefit of the doubt.
I don't know.
But
I
you
don't
have
know.
something a little more upbeat to talk
I
about
do.
first, don't you, Seth?
I do indeed. So you guys have heard us mention Old Salt coffee before, and we're going to do it again today. Let me just tell you a little bit about these guys. Old Salt Coffee was started by a couple of Navy veterans with a passion for Navy culture and history. Their mission statement is, quote, bring sailors together, past and present, to share their sea stories over a cup of Old Salt coffee, unquote. This is a little message directly from them to us. Quote, when we found your podcast, we were hooked. While we are not sponsors, we would still like to make a special offer available to you and your audience. Use discount code Pacific Podcast 20. I'll repeat it, Pacific Podcast 20 on the website at checkout and take 20% off of everything in your first purchase. These guys aren't just a company. They actually have a mission, and they have a worthwhile mission. They make a donation to veteran-related nonprofits with every single bag of coffee they sell. Nonprofits are listed in the About Us section of their website and include, when you buy Brown Shoe Blend, they make a donation to Tailhook Educational Foundation, Hayes Gray Blend, Battleship Cove, which of course is USS Massachusetts, and other ships in Massachusetts, duh. Battleship Blend, which donates to the USS Missouri and USS New Jersey memorials. Silent Service, Bill's personal favorite, Dolphin Scholarship Foundation, and Green Eyes, the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. These guys are really, 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 really cool people. I'm going to put their link on the screen here right now, along with the discount code right now. and give these guys a shot. The product is absolutely fantastic. It is, honest to God, it has become my favorite coffee, and I'm not just saying that. And no, they did not pay us anything. They've not. They did give us coffee in the beginning, but they haven't yet, and I'm not asking for it. I'm just saying we're going to plug these guys because they're cool. They listen to the show. They're really seem like really, really good people. And the product is outstanding. It really is. So give these
Yeah.
guys a shot. They're good dudes and they have amazing coffee. Old Salt
Yeah,
Coffee, oldsaltcoffee.com.
oldsaltcoffee.com. I'm so happy their silent service blend is a bold blend because that's the way I do my coffee. And if you want to do it Navy style, there's no blonde and sweet Navy style coffee. You drink it straight, the way if you drink bourbon, you ought to drink your bourbon. So
Indeed.
that's the way I do it, black and bitter. And it is got to be good quality coffee to drink it that way. And theirs is, Seth.
Indeed.
Really
I
good
like
stuff.
it is. I like my coffee like used 10W40, and that's how this stuff is. It is black as night, and it is good stuff. Good stuff.
Yep.
So on with today's topic. Oh, and before, as we always do, like and subscribe to our channel. We do appreciate it. It helps other people find our stuff. Prisoners of war. In most countries during World War II, prisoners of war, or POWs, were treated justly and fairly, or at least they were supposed to be. For the Allied nations, more often than not, when enemy combatants were captured, they were treated as the Geneva Convention prescribed, which is to say, quote, that POWs have the right to honor and respect, and that women shall be treated with all regard due to their sex, and that prisoners of a similar category must be treated in the same way, unquote. It goes on to say, quote, if requested, unless too ill to comply, prisoners are bound to give their true name and rank, but they may not be coerced into giving any more information. Prisoners' personal possessions, other than arms and horses, may not be taken from them. Food must be of a similar quality and quantity to that of the belligerent's own soldiers, and POWs cannot be denied food as a punishment. A canteen selling local produce and products should be provided. Adequate clothing should be provided, and that sanitary service in camps should be more than sufficient to prevent epidemics. Work must fit the rank and health of the prisoners. The work must not be war-related and must be safe work. And as I said, for the most part, those stipulations were met by most countries. Yes, Allied POWs in Germany suffered towards the end of the war, mainly due to lack of food, but the Germans were hungry too. And yes, obviously, German and Soviet treatment of their prisoners was horrendous. But for the most part, treatment of POWs, especially those held by the United States or Great Britain and Australia, was good, exceptionally good, quite honestly. The same could not be said of prisoners of the Japanese. The Japanese military during World War II saw Allied prisoners of war as less than human. To surrender or be captured was a disgrace worse than death. Actually, death was favored. Therefore, any person, male or female, that was captured by the Japanese during the war, no matter the nationality, faced a hard road filled with starvation, disease, inhumane living conditions, beatings, torture, and murder. To be captured by the Japanese during the war was a fate, as many who managed to survive would say, was worse than death itself. Bill, this is a topic that we have wanted to talk about for a very long time, and we purposely put it off to this season because, obviously the last couple episodes we've talked about liberating prisoners of war, be they civilians at Santo Tomas or American Bataan Death March survivors at Cabanatuan. So this is, we felt, was the fitting place to begin this conversation, but it's just, be advised, this is not a light topic by any means, but it deserves everyone's attention, Bill.
It does, yeah. So let me set the stage with a few points up front. The first one is I had several relatives that were in the Italian army during World War II. I talked about one that was in the Italian army during World War I, in the Bersaglieri, bicycle infantry. But one of my Italian great uncles, several times removed, was captured by the United States during World War II and spent time in an American POW camp outside of Seattle. When the war was over, I met this guy years later, in 1995. I met him. When the war was over, he didn't want to go back to Italy. His life in the POW camp in the United States was better than his life as a poor dirt farmer in Italy. He didn't want to go back. So that kind of tells you that we actually, walk the walk, not just talk the talk, as it pertained to the Geneva Convention. Now, there are actually several Geneva Conventions. The one that pertained to prisoners of war is the third Geneva Convention, and it is just as Seth read it. There's a fourth Geneva Convention that has to do with treatment of civilians and non-combatants during wartime. And both of these are violated, and we're going to get into that in a moment. The third thing I want to say is that it wasn't always this way for Japan. The Meiji Emperor's Rescript, and I'm going from memory here, I think it was about 1888 for soldiers and sailors, were as good as any guidance on treatment of prisoners of war of any European or American or allied nation. The guidance for Japanese soldiers and sailors in the 1800s was above board, straight from the emperor. And Seth, that kind of fell apart in the 1930s, didn't it?
It did. It did, and part of this can be attributed to the culture, literally the culture within the Japanese military, not just the Army, but the Navy too. It was common, Bill, for officers in the Imperial Army and Navy to strike junior officers and especially enlisted men. Physical or corporal punishment, I guess is the better term, was a common thing in the Japanese military, not just in the 30s, but all the way through World War II and even before to an extent. So, these people had grown up with that. That's not an excuse by any means, as we're going to clarify here in just a few minutes. But Rich Frank, who's a good friend of ours, said, quote, "It was not surprising then that the common enlisted man often took out his frustrations and anger on those whom he had conquered and felt less than Japanese," unquote. And the notion of surrender, and we've talked about this before. We've talked about this on Tarawa and Peleliu and especially Saipan. The notion of surrender to the Japanese was hated. I don't even want to say foreign because they were obviously keenly aware of what it was and what it meant. But it was, it had been pounded into their head that it was an unbearable shame to surrender to anybody, no matter the circumstances, no matter your fate, whatever. Thereby, anybody who surrendered to them or was captured without fighting to the death, literally, was held in great contempt, be they Asian, which of course is to read Chinese, or white Europeans. And they held that belief throughout the war, Bill.
Yeah, they did. The Japanese Army and Navy were fundamentally taught not to surrender at any time. Right, getting back to that corporal punishment bit, Seth, I saw this is not Japanese, but Koreans doing that still in the 1980s. So it took a long time for that practice of officers beating enlisted, senior enlisted beating junior enlisted to die. It doesn't happen anymore. But as late as the 1980s, that was still happening in several Asian militaries, not just the Korean ones that I saw. So the Japanese Army and Navy were taught not to surrender at any time. Therefore, anyone who did surrender was less than human and not worthy of proper treatment, medical aid, or even the basics of life. In China, the Japanese, having taken vast numbers of Chinese prisoners, we're talking about, and we're going to talk about the South Asia in a minute, where large numbers there as well. It became simply overwhelming. So they simply executed the majority of them. And again, we can't excuse this. It is absolute violation of law, and to the extent that we knew about it, they were punished after the war ended. And later they did claim, though, they didn't have logistics to care for them, and they acted as if that was an excuse for killing them and abusing them. And the belief is that the military was that the Chinese were always a threat, even after they captured. Same thing they felt about the Filipinos when they conquered, the Philippines as well. It simply couldn't happen. The slaughter began. And so going along with the fear of releasing Chinese prisoners, the Japanese view of the Chinese and later of the Americans, British, Dutch, and Aussies, is truly revealed in a statement made by Japanese Kwangtung Army staff officer named Yukichi Tanaka, who said, to be perfectly frank, the way you and I look at the Chinese is fundamentally different. You seem to think of them as human, but we see them as pigs, Seth. And
Yeah.
they really meant it.
Oh, they meant it 100%. Yeah. I mean, there is no ambiguity in that statement at all. They 100% believed that the Chinese were dirt. And the Japanese, for anybody who, and we're going to do an episode later on the Japanese home front and the Japanese road to war and all that jazz. It was a racial war in the Pacific. And I'm not talking about just the Americans and the Japanese. I'm talking about the Japanese. They believed that they were the superior Asian race, and they wanted to subjugate. They gave out this mythology about the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which is very difficult to say, which was just a fib, to put it mildly. Got to watch those YouTube words, and it was just it. I'm not going to let that one die, but it was just a cloak to shield the fact that they felt that they were superior to every other race on Earth, and that they were going to subjugate every human being they came across. And that's just the bottom line. That's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And we as Westerners usually look at the early months of the Pacific War, when that's usually, after December 7th, 1941, for obvious reasons. And that's what we're going to focus on a lot today. So those who want to talk about the Chinese, like the rape of Nanking and all that, we will do that in the future, but not here. The early months of the Pacific War, Bill, as we all know, were bad, to say the least, for the Allies. Defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat. And these defeats were not small defeats. They were stinging defeats. And the Japanese captured huge amounts of prisoners of war. In and around Java in 1942, the Japanese netted massive amounts of Allied POWs. By the end of the Java campaign, the Japanese had captured a staggering 82,618 Allied prisoners of war. The majority were Dutch, some 66,219 of them, 4,890 Australians, 10,626 Brits, and 883 Americans were among this massive haul. The capture of such large amounts of prisoners of war essentially netted Imperial Japan with slaves, as we shall see. Many, but certainly not all, of these POWs were sent to Burma and Japan itself later on, and we'll get to that in just a bit. And while the future suffering of these men, Bill, was often made them wish they had stayed and fought in the Javanese jungles, an incident that was reported after the war makes it look like their decision to surrender, at least now, may have been the right one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there was also Korean slaves. Let's not forget about them. But to some extent, the Koreans had no choice because their families were captured as well, captured in Korea. In many cases, the Korean slaves had no choice but to cooperate with the Japanese. And in April 1942, the Japanese Kempeitai were finally able to round up the remaining allies who'd fled into the jungles. We're talking about Southeast Asia right now. Some 200 or so Allied POWs were captured and placed in 3-foot-long bamboo hog baskets, and then put on a ship to be transported to Surabaya. On the way to the destination, these men were unceremoniously tossed into shark-infested waters, still in their hog baskets, to meet their fate. Such was the treatment of Allied POWs by the Empire of Japan. Some of the first Americans to fall under the Japanese yoke were the crewmen of the sunken heavy cruiser USS Houston, which was CA-30. We talked about this ship a little bit, I think in season 1. The cruiser was in the Philippines when the war broke out, and by 1942 was part of the Asiatic Fleet, and had later a combined national fleet under Dutch command. People forget that. Yes, we had ships under Dutch command early in the war. She escaped destruction several times, mostly from enemy air attacks, but her luck ran out at the end of February 42, when the Allies engaged an overwhelmingly powerful Japanese force in the Battle of Java Sea. As we said in season 1, the battle was an Allied disaster. But the Houston and the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth managed to escape the debacle. Ordered to the Indian Ocean, the pair was caught by the Japanese in Sunda Strait. Perth was sunk by torpedoes, leaving Houston to fight alone in an epic one-sided battle against an entire Japanese task force. The Indian Ocean in these days was not good news for Allied warships. After fighting desperately and valiantly, Houston was sunk over roughly 1,100 men. And this is going to have a lot of resonance for people who understand the story of the Indianapolis. Of roughly 1,100 men, only 368 survived the battle. 316 survived the Indianapolis sinking in 45. But we'll get to that in a few months. For 3 days, the survivors floated in rafts, in the water, in floater nets, never far from land, but far enough, thanks to the current, not to be able to reach land. Eventually, however, most of these men in the water were able to reach land or were picked up by Japanese ships or boats. Once ashore, most of the men were well treated. They were given food, some medical assistance, and told they would be transported out of the area soon. Beatings were uncommon at this time, and the Japanese seemed to show the crew of the gallant ship much respect, probably due to the fact that the ship went down fighting. But Seth, it wasn't always this way, was it?
Oh, no. It certainly gets worse as their time proceeds. After herding most of the men from the Houston into one area, the Japanese shipped them off to Serjang, Java. While they were there, the realities of their future became very clear. One Houston survivor named David Flynn recalled, quote, "We were made to stand in a destroyed railway station surrounded by many soldiers with fixed bayonets. Eventually, we were herded into a native movie theater. The seats had been removed and the prisoners seated in a cross-legged fashion. It was not possible to lie down. The Japanese manned alcoves and boxes with machine guns. Food was a rarity and consisted of rice and boiling water. Prisoners continued to die. Sanitary facilities consisted of a trench located at the rear of the shelter. Flies abounded. My left leg began to swell." Flynn was wounded when he abandoned USS Houston. He continues, "A couple of Aussies took me to the purse doctor who set up shop outside the theater near the latrine trenches. He lanced my leg using a razor blade." Sounds like fun. "Weeks later, we were moved to bicycle camp in Jakarta. The camp was a staging area for shipment of POWs to Saigon's coal mines, steel mills, and shipyards as slave labor. Officers were sent to Manchuria. Selection seemed to be based on physical wellness and was made by a Japanese doctor. Meanwhile, I remained in Java. We were ordered by the Japanese to sign a document stating we'd worked for Dai Nippon and we would make no attempt to escape. Our officers ordered us not to sign. To do so would be considered traitorous, they said. The officers were then taken away. Every 15 minutes, a Japanese bashing squad would come yelling and would beat us with rifle butts and clubs. It was decided between the POWs that this constituted duress, and so we signed their piece of paper," unquote. Beatings, Bill, like the one Flynn absorbed, became all the more common. The Japanese were initially the guards of the Houston. The Japanese guards that were initially the guards of the Houston men were combat veterans from China. These guys had come out of Manchuria. And again, like you said just a couple minutes ago, these guys seemed to respect the Houston survivors to a degree because it became widely known that these guys from this ship fought like lions. They really did. And the Japanese respected that. They did not respect the fact that they allowed themselves to be captured, but they did respect the fact that they put up one heck of a fight. While the treatment at their hands was not particularly bad, although they did receive beatings here and there, the men who replaced these guys were absolutely horrendous, Bill.
Yeah, they were. So this is where I talked about Korean slaves and conscripts. In this case, there was a situation where Korean conscripts were put in charge of the POWs, and these Koreans, to use the expression, had gone native. Many of these men, small in stature, hated the taller, larger Americans, and such regularly beat the men. So tall were some of the Americans that the Koreans made them stand in pits so the shorter Koreans could beat the taller Americans in the head. Adopting the British term slang of bashing, I didn't realize that the Brits had started calling them bashing, but I thought that was an American expression too. But it turns out the Brits were using it before we were. The beatings were, as one man said, a way of life under the Japanese, only it would get worse. After being held at what the POWs called the bicycle camp, we spoke about that earlier, where the majority enlisted men worked for the Japanese at the Shell warehouse, moving oil and grease barrels onto ships. They were told that they were being sent to a rest area. Loaded up in an English freighter that had been captured at Singapore, the POWs were crammed in the ship's hold and brought to Burma in January 1943. One survivor, Howard Brooks, said, "We learned that we were to build a railway from Moulmein down near Bangkok. We were put in a camp that had a boundary marked with string attached to small sticks. That was in lieu of a fence, which hadn't been built yet.
Yeah.
There were strict orders not to go beyond the boundary. One evening, some of us were standing near the boundary, and a guard accused us of trying to escape. Our punishment was to kneel with a 3-inch diameter piece of bamboo behind the knees. Soon your legs became numb and you could tolerate it better. You couldn't tolerate any longer. I don't remember how long they had us stay there, but when they let us go, we could not walk." Seth, this is the beginning of what became a long and agonizing experience for a lot of Allied prisoners. The majority of them were not Americans in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the Burma-Thai Railway, of course, is what we're talking about. And it was a absolute living hell. Living and working conditions in Burma would deteriorate rapidly. Soon after arriving in Burma, the Houston survivors met many of their allies. And like Bill said, the majority of the Allied prisoners of war in this region were British, Dutch, and Australian. They would all suffer an absolutely torturous life on this Burma-Thai Railway, or as the POWs called it, the Railway of Death. And that is not an understatement, as you will see. Following their 1942 invasion of Burma and future expansion, the Japanese quickly realized that resupplying, or that just keeping the area in supply of their newly captured territory, would prove more difficult than initially expected. American submarines, Bill, prowled the area around the Malay Peninsula, the Straits of Malacca, vulnerable and accessible to Allied submarines, not just American, but British and Dutch as well. The Japanese quickly determined that an overland supply route would be their best option. In September 1942, the Japanese started construction on the railway initially with local forced labor. The notion of such a railway was not new. The British had considered it in the late Victorian period. However, the considerable problems of traversing thick jungle terrain had rendered the project as unfeasible and too expensive. Yet this did not deter the Japanese. We've talked about this a gazillion times, Bill. Westerners think that, a piece of land is, inaccessible, or there's no way the Japanese could get over the Owen Stanley Mountains, and they consistently do it again and again and again and again. By mid-June 1942, the construction on the line had commenced. Unlike the Victorian British, they being the Japanese, had no reservations about employing forced labor to do the majority of the dangerous and dirty work. Once built, theoretically, the railway would form a connection from Ban Pong in Thailand, some 45 miles west of Bangkok, to, I can't even pronounce it, in Burma, approximately 35 miles south of another place I can't pronounce. The line crossing the border between the two countries at a point known as the Three Pagodas Pass. In total, about 258 miles of track would be laid to connect these areas, Bill.
Yeah. So, Seth, people that are fans of the Southeast Asia campaign of World War II are probably in their minds visualizing Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, that's right.
Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, "What have I done?"
Mm-hmm.
In the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai. That is
That's
what
right.
we're talking about, folks.
Exactly.
It was a real story. You can actually visit the real bridge. I tried to do that when I was in Thailand once. I couldn't get there. I just didn't have the time. The physical construction of that railway was extremely arduous and deadly. The route passed through long stretches of mosquito-infested jungle, and frequent monsoons greatly hampered the work. The terrain was often uneven, and in addition to the construction of bridges across rivers and canyons, large sections of mountains had to be cut through in order to lay the narrow gauge track on level ground. Recalling his work on the Burma Railway, John Swan, a British prisoner, said, "We were given a basket between two men and two handles. We were in a chain gang carrying soil and depositing it to make a base for the railway lines. Food was rice 3 times a day, and vegetables were so-called stew in the evenings after a hot day in the sun." Another notorious section of the Burma Railway is Hellfire Pass, located in the Tessarim Hills. Also known as Konyu cutting, it was the deepest and longest cutting of the entire railway, and just as the bridge on the River Kwai has come to symbolize British suffering, Hellfire Pass is similarly often associated with the Australians' misery. The pass itself is some 246 feet long and 82 feet deep. Much of the work was carried out by hand, with a few tools available, making the cutting process particularly difficult, Seth.
Yeah, it is absolutely. There's a reason it's called Hellfire Pass, because it's absolute hell on earth. The work on the pass was done initially by some 1,500 Brits and 2,000 Tamil workers beginning in November 1942. By April the following year, however, some 400 Australian prisoners from T Battalion of D Force were sent to work on the cutting, and by June, a further 600 Brits and Aussies from H Force were brought up after work had fallen behind schedule. Besides the punishing working conditions, some 69 men are said to have been mercilessly beaten to death by their sadistic Japanese guards in Hellfire Pass during the 12 weeks it took to complete the work. Many more are known to have died of disease, but it remains uncertain exactly how many prisoners and Ramusha perished while working on the cutting itself. Despite the considerable achievements of the Japanese engineers and their reluctant, putting it mildly, Bill, reluctant forced laborers, progress on the Burma Railway soon fell behind schedule. In response, the infamous speedo period took place between July and October 1943, during which the conditions of the workers rapidly deteriorated even further. The Allied prisoners were forced to work around the clock in a desperate attempt to make up time and get the railway back on schedule. With 18-hour shifts becoming common practice, hardly a day would pass during the speedo period without the death of a prisoner, with casualty rates climbing sharply. The Japanese guards would be heard aggressively screaming, "Speedo, speedo," at the prisoners, coercing them to work ever harder and faster, Bill.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable agony here, because it's the extremely difficult physical labor that would be near impossible if you were in the best of conditions, and these people were in the worst of conditions. Medical care had been limited from the start and became even more so during the speedo period. The Allied doctors and medics did what they could to relieve the suffering of the sick and injured, but they didn't have anything, coming up with somewhat ingenious methods to help their desperate patients. Ulcers were a particular problem, often resulting from a small cut on bare feet or legs and becoming infected. Little could be done but to cut away the dead flesh, usually agonizingly scraped away using a teaspoon or a similar object, in the hope of preventing the infection from spreading further into gangrene and things like that. In the worst cases, amputations without anesthetic would be made using makeshift surgical tools that were given to them to build the bridge and do the construction. Nevertheless, the Japanese, demanding better results, forced even the sick to carry on with their work, even though many of them could hardly walk, let alone perform the back-breaking tasks expected of them. Other diseases, no surprise here, among the Allied prisoners also became prevalent, with dysentery, diarrhea, accounting for about a third of all deaths. Poor diet also led to conditions such as beriberi, pellagra, caused by lack of vitamin B1 and niacin, since the Japanese predominantly fed the prisoners on rice alone. Mosquitoes carried malaria, which caused around 2% of all deaths, while cholera was also a serious menace, causing about 12% of deaths. Really, all the doctors could do is keep these statistics. They couldn't do much to help it at all. The roughly 60,000 Allied POWs who worked on the railway of death, some 12,621 died either by disease, malnutrition, or execution, Seth.
Yeah. And, you know, this little blurb that we did on the Burma-Thai Railway is frankly insufficient to the story. And we might pick it up again in the future, but it was truly, you know, the movie, you know, there's some question as to the writer of the book that, you know, became the movie as a Frenchman, if he really did a lot of the things or claimed or saw a lot of the things that he claimed he saw. Regardless of that, that movie, which is, of course, Bridge on the River Kwai, is a pretty accurate representation of these kind of episodes. What they don't show in that movie often, or often enough, are the executions, the random executions, because they happen almost on a daily basis. And sometimes it wasn't just one guy, you know, they'd shoot 4, 5, 6 guys at a time. And you know that the movie about Japanese prisoners of war, or the movie about prisoners of war of the Japanese, has not been made yet, in my opinion, the most
No.
accurate one. But
Yeah. And in fact, the one thing that does not resonate with me from that movie was the Japanese commander crying out of
yeah,
frustration. I mean,
right,
I never heard anything. And the movie really underrepresents, based on the period it was made, it couldn't have represented the dysentery,
right,
all the horrors, because they wouldn't have released it
right.
if they made it as accurate as it should have been. So I guess they did the best they could with the movie, but it significantly underrepresents the horror that those guys went through.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, Bill, there's another term that became synonymous with the prisoner of war experience in the Pacific, and that term is, of course, the hell ship. The term came from those poor, unfortunate souls who were crammed into the holds of Japanese ships, often freighters, in unlivable conditions, and eventually transported to destinations in Manchuria or, more often, mainland Japan. After late 1942, the Japanese began to transport POWs from all over their conquered territory to mainland Japan and mainland Asia. The only reliable way to transport these men were via ship. Following their requisition of shipping, the Japanese military would cram these ships with prisoners of war. The holds of these ships were described as, quote, floating dungeons where inmates were denied air, space, light, bathroom facilities, and adequate food and water, especially water. John Jacobs, a prisoner of war captured in the Philippines, recalled, and I quote, the prisoners had been so crowded in these other holds that they couldn't even get air to breathe. They went crazy, cut and bit each other through their arms and legs, and sucked their blood in order to keep from being murdered. Many had to climb the ladders and were promptly shot by the guards. Between 20 and 30 prisoners died of suffocation or were murdered during the night, unquote. That's just one account, and we're going to get to a lot more. And when he's talking about murder, he's talking about murder at the hands of his fellow prisoners. These guys had lost it, literally had been driven mad by their captivity, through their captivity, by the Japanese. You know, mental anguish, physical beatings, lack of food, lack of water, lack of vitamins, lack of medicine, you name it. And these people were denied it. You know, and they were steadily losing their minds. And you'll see in a lot of these accounts of guys that were on hell ships, it really hit its climax when they were on these ships, because the conditions, at least when you're outside, yeah, it sucks. that you're out there in the sun, but at least you're outside. You know what I mean? And you go into these hell ships, and it's like standing in a broom closet with 30 of your closest friends, and you really got to pee, and you haven't had anything to eat in 5 days, and it's about 130 degrees. Sounds like fun, you know. And these guys already teetering on the brink of insanity are literally driven insane by the conditions in which they lived in. And this whole drinking blood thing, it sounds like I'm making it up. Honest to God, I'm not. This is direct quotes from survivors of these absolutely terrible events. One guy
Mm.
whom I did not admittedly have the pleasure to know, although I listened to his oral history about 35 times, my good friend Tommy Lofton, who's down the hall, who was on our show when we did Masters, interviewed him, was a Marine named Ray Church. Ray Church had been captured on Guam in 1941 by the Japanese, and he related a very similar experience. In his first few months of capture, Ray lost 40 pounds and was beset by malaria. Having been starved purposely for weeks on end, Church and the rest of the Marines on Guam that had been captured were transferred from Guam to Japan, Shikoku to be exact. And his journey from Guam to Japan was aboard one of these ships, Bill.
Yeah, Church recalled at one point we were herded into groups of about 25 and waited to get on the ship. We were put aboard the Argentine Maru. Maru means merchant ship. That's the name tagged on to, so it was probably a captured Argentinian ship that the Japanese renamed Argentine Maru. We got aboard. They were herded into the bilge area of the ship, literally standing on the V-shaped bottom of the ship itself down to the keel. The heat nearly overwhelmed us as we stumbled down some steep stairs to the bottom of the ship. The space was terribly small, some 150 American civilians, about 160 Marines, and another 120 or so sailors. Rats as big as dogs scurried everywhere, while the Japanese guard above us dropped cigarette butts on us. That's the most pleasant thing that was done. Food? What food? The Japanese poured buckets of brown rice on us each day, and we poured on it like starving dogs. By the time we got north, we were freezing. This was sometime in January, northern Japan. We talked about trying to take over the ship, but there was no way we could. We later heard that should we be torpedoed, the Japanese guards were ordered to shoot us as the ship went down. As it turned out, Church had every right to be concerned about being sunk. While his hell ship was not sunk, a great many others were. The Japanese, against the rules of war, transported the POWs via unmarked ships. No markings told any prowling American submarine or overflying aircraft that the ships carried POWs. There are no markings on them to tell them that the ships carried POWs. As such, the war progressed, and submarines especially became more deadly, meaning many of these hell ships were sunk, Seth.
Yeah. By the end of the war, 134 Japanese hell ships had together embarked on more than 156 voyages, which carried an estimated 126,000 Allied prisoners of war. Approximately 1,540 Allied POW deaths resulted from conditions in the holds and violence aboard the hell ships, whereas more than 19,000 deaths of Allied prisoners of war occurred as a consequence of Allied attacks. The U.S. Navy carried out most of these attacks, but with the help of Allied intelligence services and the Royal Navy's Far East patrols as well. On September 18, 1944, for example, a British submarine torpedoed and sank the Japanese hell ship Junyo Maru. Nearly 6,000 people died. 4,120 Javanese laborers, read slaves, and 1,520 Allied prisoners of war. Montevideo Maru became the first of the hell ships to be sunk by the United States Navy on 1st of July, 1942. Lieutenant Commander William L. Wright's submarine USS Sturgeon, which was SS-187, had been in pursuit of its target for several hours before finally launching a torpedo attack in the small hours of the morning. Within minutes of the first explosion, Montevideo Maru sank by the stern. There had not even been time to pump the holds or lower more than half of the lifeboats. More than 1,000 Australian troops and 200 Australian administrative personnel captured by the Japanese in New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomon Islands went down with the ship. By the fall of 1944, Bill, radio traffic had reached a frenzy within the Pacific Theater because at this time, October-ish, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is kicking off, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So when we say that it was helped by British and American intelligence, what we're saying is we had word that the ships were underway.
Right.
That intelligence did not tell us that there were POWs on board, unfortunately. And since the Battle of Leyte Gulf signaled the start of American reconquest of the Philippines, it prompted the Japanese to move resources and people, including POWs, to Japanese home islands. Towards the end of 1944, as the Americans took more and more territory in the Philippines, they effectively flushed out tens of thousands of Allied POWs. In the mad rush to evacuate, the Japanese massively overloaded their requisition merchant vessels with supplies and people. Conditions deteriorated quickly. Civilians and military personnel crowded the vessel's superstructures and upper decks. Allied POWs languished in abject wretchedness below. In haste, the requisition merchant vessels steamed north, trying to outrun the U.S. Navy. But Navy officers armed with the latest intel had the decisive advantage. The Hell ships in particular, which were poorly defended and heavily laden, and that's what, if you're going after ships, you want to see them riding low in the water. It means they're carrying a lot of goods, supplies, fuel oil. That's better than sinking empty ships that are riding high in the water. Unfortunately, these ships were carrying Allied prisoners, and they were sunk in great numbers. One case in particular is a good example. The Oryoko Maru, in December 13, 1944, the Oryoko Maru was crammed with over 1,600 American POWs. One survivor, Lieutenant Colonel O.O. Wilson, described the scene. Quote, "The hold is about 25 to 30 feet from the main deck and reachable by a steep ladder, which one man could descend at a time. Only one could get up and down at a time. Bays in double tiers were built around the hold, these bays being about 7 feet by 8 feet. 20 men were jammed into each upper bay and lower bay. The only way possible of crowding that number into such a small compartment was to have each man sit jammed into the crotch of the man behind him in 4 rows with 5 men to a row. When all the bays had been filled in this fashion, all remaining space in the hold was filled by men in a standing position, packed one against the other, standing up." We have an expression for that in the military. I'm not going to use it here. Cutting off all air for men in the bay. It soon became evident to all that men would die very quickly from heat exhaustion and suffocation. These men, survivors of the Bataan Death March, were soon set upon unknowingly by their fellow countrymen.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
On December 14th, the Oryoko Maru's convoy was sighted and attacked by aircraft from USS Hornet. This is CV-12. USS Cabot's aircraft soon joined the fray, with the attack coming and going for 2 hours. As the ship came under attack, the POWs began to panic and tried to reach the deck. As they got near the hatches, the Japanese opened fire on them. As the ship came under attack, the American aircraft began to strafe the decks, crammed with Japanese civilians that were leaving the Philippines. The following morning, the battered ship came under attack again. And Seth, what happened then?
It's a horror show. It's an absolute horror show. The aircraft coming in, strafe the deck again, dropping bombs all over the place, multiple rockets Then you got to remember this is late 44 now, so our Hellcats are doing most of the killing of ships. Um, rocket fire absolutely started to tear this thing apart. There's photographs of this ship that I'll show here in the presentation. Girders buckled, fires engulfed the upper decks. As POWs, bloodied and terrorized, clambered up the hatches from the holds, Japanese sentries simply shot them dead. Yet the men kept coming. There's 1,600 guys in here. It's like a flood, like when you kick over an ant hill, forced out of the holds and into the fires by rising water. Eventually, the chaos, the strafing, and the fires became too much for the Japanese jailers. I didn't say sailors. I said jailers, who abandoned the ship. More than 1,000 POWs escaped the ship and swam to shore where the Japanese rounded them up again. Most of these guys were loaded onto another hell ship, which was sunk off the coast of Formosa, now Taiwan. The survivors from that sinking went on to Japan, where they suffered until the end of the war. Of the 1,600 men who boarded Oryoko Maru, 1,000 never made it to Japan. Those who did were sent to Korea, where by the end of the war, only 128 of the original 1,600 Americans were found alive. That's just one. That's just one instance. One.
And there were 100 of these ships.
Hundreds of them.
Not all of them sunk, but
no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah. And then we think it's necessary to talk about some special prisoners of war that y'all might have heard about, because we've kind of hinted at some of these stories over our last 3 seasons. And so we want to tie some of these out. I want to spend a little bit of time on the Submariner when we get to them, but we're going to start here. Prisoners of war are I'm going to quote here from the Geneva Convention, and this is the third Geneva Convention, 1929. Prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile power, but not in the individual or corps who have captured them. They must at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Measures of reprisals against them are prohibited. So that's out of the Third Geneva Convention, 1929. The Japanese treated most POWs the same, which is to say brutally. However, the Japanese reserved a few prisoners and treated them differently, a different level of brutality. These different prisoners, the Japanese termed as special prisoners. And trust me, you do not want to be a special prisoner. They were usually captured airmen, well-known personalities, or submariners, and we're going to talk about one of those in a minute. These men were kept away from every other prisoner and received special treatment at the hands of the Japanese. More often than not, the Kempeitai. Routinely treated to rounds of torture and beatings, these men suffered more than the average prisoner of the Japanese, and that is to say something significant. A group of these so-called special prisoners were captured by the Japanese in the Formosa Straits in October 1944. Now we're getting to the point I want to make. 9 prisoners to be exact, all survivors from the sunken submarine USS Tang. And it's this story starts out not too bad after they're captured. I'll talk about that in a minute, but why don't you set the scene for us here, Seth?
Yeah, so if you want to know the story of the Tang, and she is probably the most famous submarine in American naval history, certainly the most successful. Go back to, was it season 2, Bill? I think we did an episode with Drac about Dick O'Kane and the USS Tang, and we go through everything there. But suffice it to say that the night before these guys are picked up, the USS Tang had just ravaged a Japanese convoy, absolutely ravaged a Japanese convoy. The last torpedo she fired, on which was going to be Dick O'Kane's last patrol, was a boomerang, came back and hit the American submarine and sank it. 9 men survived the sinking, either by being washed overboard from the bridge or escaping the actual sunken submarine, either using a Momsen lung or the blow and go technique. Suffice it to say, it was a harrowing day for those guys, and their adventure hadn't even really started yet. By the autumn of 1944, American submarines were absolutely annihilating Japanese supply lines. The pig boats were sinking virtually everything that floated, and I do mean everything that floated, and causing tens of thousands of Japanese casualties, both civilian and military. As the sinkings progressed, the hatred for American submariners grew, and you can understand why, within the Japanese Navy. The rare chance for capture usually meant one thing for any unfortunate sailor who was found by the Japanese, of course, that was death. However, after their infamous attack, the 9 survivors of USS Tang floated in small groups or separately until they were picked up by the Japanese the following morning. Initially mistaken for Japanese survivors, once the Americans were recognized and then recognized as submariners, the special treatment really began. Cigarette butts were put out on their faces or up their nose. They were beaten, kicked, slapped, denied water, all while being hogtied on the steel deck of a Japanese patrol boat in the blazing sun. After letting them cook in the sun, the interrogations began. Floyd Caverly was taken below decks and questioned. Why, when he didn't give any information, he was struck in the side of the head with the flat end of a sword. Bill Leibold was next. I knew Bill Leibold. He's now deceased, God rest his soul. The chief told the Japanese nothing, and they beat him with a club. The Japanese stuck electrical wires into Jesse da Silva's ribs and slowly gave him jolts of electricity. This is aboard the ship. This isn't even on land yet. When it became clear that the crewmen weren't going to say anything, the torture stopped. For now, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so after 4 days on the deck of the patrol boat, the survivors were thrown in Formosan jail because they were sunk in the Straits of Formosa, if you remember the story from back in season 2.
2, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and so they were chained to the walls by the wrists, high up on the wall, and hung there. This is, medieval style torture.
Yes.
Consistent beatings, cigarette treatments were given to the men, chained against the wall for days on end. Transported to Japan, the officers on a destroyer and the enlisted men in the belly of a cruiser. The men reached their destination after several days. Now, I want to stop for a moment here and talk. And we're going to talk about Richard O'Kane and his treatment ashore. But there's some kind of interesting stories about him, his treatment on this destroyer, because things actually didn't look very bad for him personally at first, and he actually had hopes. He doesn't speak much about this in his book, but he speaks a little bit about it in the epilogue of his book. The captain of this destroyer actually brought him to his cabin, gave him warm, dry clothes, and went down and would converse with him and ask him, questions like, why aren't your torpedoes better? How come they can make a circle and sink you? How can you sink, what, don't you have anti-circular run? The captain actually spoke English. And there's an amusing story where the captain, first he would challenge O'Kane, how can we make peace with each other if you guys don't care enough to learn some of our language? At least I cared enough to learn English. And he would want to speak about literature with O'Kane. In particular, he pulled a book off of his shelf that he called Went with the Breeze. Right. Have you read this book, Went with the Breeze? And O'Kane was confused because it was written in Japanese, and it took him a while to figure out he's talking about Gone with the Wind. Right. Went with the Breeze. But he was treated very well while he was on this destroyer. Things changed the moment they got ashore. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the Japanese provided, once they got ashore, Japanese provided no new clothing, no shoes, as the men were marched through a Japanese naval base and put on a train. After a day's ride on that train, they arrived at their final destination. The POW camp they arrived at had earned a particularly sinister name, and soon the Tang survivors would see how true that name really was. It was called the Torture Farm, Seth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pleasant name. Nice place. Ofuna was the actual name of the place. It was a secret Japanese naval intelligence base located outside of Yokohama. Opened in 1942, the camp was run by the Imperial Navy and was never, again, against the rules of war, officially reported as a prisoner of war camp. It was run, not surprisingly, with an iron fist, and the Ofuna camp was used to house these special prisoners that Bill was talking about. Upon arrival, the tank survivors quickly learned that they were not to speak to anyone. If they did so, they were beaten in the back of the legs and made to stand in what they called the Ofuna crouch, which is to say, standing on the ball of your foot, knees half bent, and arms extended over your head. I'm sure that felt good, and I'm sure it lasted a long time. Once in Ofuna, the Tang survivors were given fresh clothes and shoes. After receiving their clothing, Floyd Caverly and Bill Leibold were pulled from the line of POWs and sent to the mess hall, where they were to get some food and distribute it to the other survivors. Upon entering the mess hall, Leibold was handed a bowl of rice from a Marine pilot who seemed oddly familiar to him. Minus some 80 pounds, it was hard to recognize him at first, the man, who soon introduced himself as none other than Gregory Boyington. The Tang survivors learned that they were classified as the infamous special prisoners. Clay Decker, a survivor, recalled, quote, "They said that because we had sunken ships that had civilians on them, we were waging war against civilians, and we were not entitled to be called POWs. We would only get half rations, and they had not and would not notify the Red Cross of our capture," unquote. During one interrogation, one of the survivors was told by the Japanese, quote, "You survived a sinking submarine. No one does that. No one knows you're alive. We're going to ask you questions, and if you don't give us answers, we're going to shoot you, and no one will ever know," unquote. Welcome to
Not that
Ofuna.
it mattered to them. They were, even when the Bataan Death March, where people did know that they were alive, there was no issue with killing them.
No.
But of course, these POWs didn't know that, right? The new prisoners were lined up the following day and were given an example of life in Ofuna. The older POWs lined up and faced the new arrivals. The Japanese grabbed one man out of the older crowd, Lieutenant Commander J.A. Fitzgerald, skipper of the submarine Grenadier, and two other emaciated POWs. Fitzgerald had endured horrendous torture, including being forced to swallow boiling water and having pencils jammed into his hand between his fingers. Fitzgerald was dragged into the front of the group and promptly beaten to a pulp. And what they would do is they would beat them until they were unconscious, and they would keep beating them. Why did they keep beating them? Because they knew when they woke up. Yeah, because they could. But they knew when they woke up, they would be in even more pain because they were able to beat them more while they were unconscious, right? This is unconscionable. Commander Dick O'Kane soon received the special submariner treatment himself. Questioned on how many ships he had sunk, O'Kane lied and said, 5 ships on 5 patrols, 1 ship per patrol. What O'Kane didn't know was that the Japanese had read an American newspaper report, thank you very much, American newspapers, stating that the Tang had received the Presidential Unit Citation for sinking 110,000 tons of shipping, which is actually underestimating the tonnage, I think, that they sunk. So the beatings for O'Kane became a daily, sometimes multiple times a day affair. As 1944 turned to 45, the men in Ofuna began to see flocks of B-29s taken off for the Marianas. We'd already taken Saipan and Tinian by this time, in the skies above the camp. With the B-29s came downed airmen. These men also received the special treatment for having bombed Japan. One in particular, Lieutenant Richard Hunt, was brought into Ofuna. Hunt had been terribly burned, bailing out of his B-29, and was so burned he couldn't feed himself. The Japanese left him in solitary confinement where the man starved to death, Seth.
Yep. And they did that intentionally. O'Kane, and I believe it was Floyd Caverly and Boyington, also confirmed all of this. They saw them drag this man who was burned on both of his legs and both of his hands and arms and his face too, for that matter. His aircraft apparently had caught fire, and when he bailed out, he was afire. And they offered this man no medical treatment whatsoever, nothing. And they'd throw him food, I guess, to say that they did. but the man was so horribly burned, he literally could not pick up the food to feed himself, and he starved to death. And they let him starve to death. They didn't do anything about it. They didn't do anything to help him. Other prisoners, offered, let us go in there and feed him. They would not allow him to be fed by other prisoners of war. They purposely let the man starve to death. Yeah, nice people. So after 5 months at Ofuna, the Tang survivors were transferred to a place called Omori. Omori was a regular prisoner of war camp. The enlisted Tang survivors were led from Ofuna to Omori by Greg Boyington. Omori was on the western shore of Tokyo Bay. And as the men moved through Tokyo, they saw the devastation that had been wrought by the B-29s. Quote, everything was burnt to a crisp, unquote, recalled Floyd Caverly. Boyington said of the ruins of Tokyo, quote, I felt no sorrow for them, none at all, unquote. And Omori were a large population of downed B-29ers. A gentleman named Fisk Hanley was among them. He was a B-29 flight engineer, and he'd been shot down in March of 1945, narrowly escaping being beaten to death by a furious mob of Japanese civilians. He had initially been brought to Kokura by the Kempeitai and placed before a firing squad. Expecting to be killed, he soon realized that the firing squad was nothing but emotional and mental torture. Thrown, literally, on a train, he was brought to Omori, where his first meeting was with a Japanese named Kobayashi Yasuo, who shouted to him that he was an accused war criminal who had killed women and children. Hanley later related that the conditions in Omori were deplorable. Disease was rampant, typhus and hepatitis being the two major offenders, and if men got sick, and most of them did, they received no medical treatment at all. He related further that if a POW was unfortunate enough to get diarrhea, unless it simply vanished, which occasionally it happens, but more often than not, when you're sick enough to get it, it doesn't. The men usually died from it for lack of treatment and dehydration. That's a fun way to go, Bill.
It is. Yes. So I'm going off script here just for a second, Seth, because I want to reattack on my question I asked James Scott about Philippines and whether it was proper to invade the Philippines. Because he made the point that if we didn't invade the Philippines when we did, all the American POWs in the Philippines would have died. There were more POWs in Japan, I think, than there were in the Philippines at this point in the war. And the delay in winning the war might have had, you can make the same argument for the quicker we get to the end of the war, the quicker we defeat Japan, the quicker those guys are released. And so, again, I'm not sure I buy this argument that it was right to invade the Philippines, even if it meant delaying the end of the war. I just don't buy it. But I'll go back on script for a moment, unless you want to react to that.
Yeah, I've said my piece on that. So.
All right, good enough. All right, so another prisoner who had spent some harrowing days at Ofuna was also now at Omori, and that was one Louis Zamperini. Now, y'all probably have seen the movie, heard the story about Zamp, as he was called, and is widely known to the Japanese for his Olympic stardom. When he was initially captured, he was treated like every other POW, which is to say a slave, until he was recognized. After his torturous time at Ofuna, Zamp was sent to Omori, where he was constantly tortured by one guard in particular, Watanabe Mutsuhiro, better known as the Bird. And I think this was represented in the movie. Is it Unbreakable was the movie?
Unbroken.
I can't remember. Unbroken. Okay, yeah. He was known as the Bird. He's paid special attention to Zamperini. The Japanese wanted Zamp to get on the radio and make anti-American radio broadcasts, which of course he refused to do. At this, the Bird unleashed his wrath. Notoriously sadistic, the Bird took great pleasure out of inflicting pain on the POWs. Beating Zamperini specifically became a daily occurrence for the Bird. He would visit the Olympian in his cell over almost every night and beat him senseless. In one occurrence, the Bird forced Zamperini to hold a 6-foot wooden pole over his head in the blazing sun in front of the entire camp population. To everyone's astonishment, the Olympian managed to hold it for over 30 minutes before his camp collapsed and was promptly beaten by the bird, Seth, as you might have expected.
Yeah, I knew Zamperini not long before he passed away. I met him several times, and all I got to say is he was one of the most genuine, good people I've ever had the pleasure to know. Um, how this man found forgiveness in his heart and his soul is beyond me, frankly. But he did. It's obvious, pretty well known that he found religion, after the war, and he met Billy Graham, and that, literally, quite literally, saved his life. And he dedicated the rest of his life to forgiveness and fair treatment. He was an amazing, absolutely amazing human being, very, very kind, very soft spoken, but just a really unique person. And the movies that you're talking about, Bill, I highly recommend. I don't necessarily recommend the first one, which was Unbroken. That one was meh. The second one is Unbroken Path to Redemption. There was actually a sequel. I don't know if anybody knew that or not. We talked about it once before, and it deals with Zamp's PTSD and how he got over it. And it is heartbreaking, outstanding movie. If you ever had the opportunity to watch it, do so. It's very good. But Zamperini was just a small, instance of this torture by this guy that was known as the Bird. And the Bird he didn't just pay attention to Zamperini, although that was his main target was Louis Zamperini. He got into it with Bill Leibold of the USS Tang. These guys were the resilience of these people, these prisoners of war. And I'm not just talking about the Tang people, but Boyington too. He'd been there a while. He'd been there longer than the Tang guys. Fitzgerald, who, by the way, survived that beating that he was given in front of the Tang survivors. He survived it. He wound up surviving barely, but he did survive the war. And he was skipper of the USS Grenadier, which was a submarine that was forced to, he scuttled it to keep it from being captured by the Japanese, and he and his crew were captured. But the perseverance and the will to survive of these guys was absolutely unbelievable. And I mean, they took this as a daily occurrence. They took these beatings, this torture, this lack of food, medical care, whatever, as a daily occurrence and a way of life, because they knew, or at least they hoped, that they would survive to see the end of this war. And at the end of this war, if the Japanese didn't kill them all beforehand, they would theoretically exact their revenge. And as we're going to see, when the war does end, surprisingly, that doesn't happen. So it became clear to O'Kane that the end of the war was near when he saw United States Navy aircraft carrier aircraft over Omori. O'Kane was sick. Like, he was really sick. He was stricken with beriberi, jaundice, and hepatitis. He was quite literally near death. He had lost nearly 80 pounds, and while not tortured every day anymore, he still received the treatment at least once a week. He, more than most, needed liberation to come very soon. O'Kane and the other prisoners of war in Omori heard the radio announcement of surrender from Hirohito. Though they could not understand what was being said, the reaction of the guards made it apparently abundantly clear that the Japanese had indeed surrendered. Almost instantly, the POWs laid their work tools down and the guards let them. The war was actually over. Fearful of the guards killing them that night, the men slept 3 or 4 to a room and did their best to lock the doors of their cells by nailing them shut. That night, a drunken guard burst into the barracks, threatening to kill any American he could get his hands on. Floyd Caverly remembered his roommate, Greg Boyington, standing by the door with a hammer in his hand, ready to defend himself and Caverly, Bill.
Yeah. And, one of the things that happened before the surrender was that, the Tokyo fire bombings, and Boyington and other crews were ordered to go out dragging charred corpses from burnt buildings. And Boyington said something like, we were happy. We were glad to do it. It gave us something to do. My goodness, That was better than what they were, than just being in the POW camp, as bad as that was. On August 28, 1945, finally, American LCVPs were led in like a parade, like ducks to the wharf near Omori. The POWs saw them and immediately recognized Old Glory flying from the stern of the mothership. The POWs burst through the gates and ran toward the wharf, climbing up on the pilings and waving whatever they could get their hands on. In one of the most famous images from the end of the war, Clay Decker and Fisk Handley can clearly be seen screaming their joy at the arrival of their fellow countrymen. I suspect you're going to show that image, Seth. So O'Kane was so weak he could not walk. Now, one of O'Kane's stories was that towards the end, I think the Japanese people, civilians, knew that they were losing the war and the war was over. The civilians would start hiding like roasted soybeans, little pockets of roasted soybeans in places where they knew the POWs would find them. A small gesture of kindness by some of the civilians, which kind of indicated to O'Kane that these civilians hated the Japanese military more than they hated the American prisoners. O'Kane was so weak he couldn't walk, though. He was placed on a stretcher. He was brought with other stretcher cases to a Navy doctor who said, he's never going to make it, so leave him here for now. On hearing this, O'Kane said, there's no way I'm staying here. I'm going to make it. I've come this far. I'm going the rest of the way. So he is among the first off the beach, but he drifted in and out of consciousness on the hospital ship Benevolence. Now, Bill Leibold learned where his captain was being held on the ship and stayed with him. An officer aboard the ship ordered the chief bosun's mate to leave, and Leibold told him, no way I'm leaving this man. It's just not going to happen, sir. O'Kane was being fed intravenously and would recover. Several days later, Leibold was sent home while the skipper continued to heal, Seth.
Yeah, and there's a picture that I'm going to show here of Greg Boyington on the Benevolence, on the hospital ship, and he's shaking hand. I think it's hospital ship. Regardless, he's shaking hands with American naval officers, and Boyington doesn't look. He looks certainly a heck of a lot thinner than he should have been, but he doesn't look terrible. And Greg Boyington, being the man he was, there's a neat little story that he had. Basically, he worked in the mess hall by bribing some of the Japanese guards. No surprise if you know anything about Boyington. If you don't, go listen to episode 214. He bribed the Japanese guards to be able to work in the mess hall so he could get some food, because he too was starving. As I said, he'd lost 40, 60, 80 pounds, whatever it was. He was in bad shape, but he was in nowhere near bad a shape as Dick O'Kane. And if you see this picture of Boyington that I'm going to show, if you look behind him, there's an American standing in a United States Army M43 field jacket, and this jacket is swallowing him. It's Richard O'Kane. And O'Kane looks like a human skeleton. He looks like a bag of bones, and you could tell just by looking at the man's face, he was near death's door. He was going to die. Had he not been liberated as soon as he was, he probably wouldn't have lasted another week or two. So he obviously does survive, and he does make it out of the situation to receive the Medal of Honor from President Truman on the White House lawn. But rescue of these prisoners of war, for many of them, literally came at exactly the right time. And of course, and some of them also passed away, unfortunately, as they were being rescued, or liberated, I should say. So, prisoners of the Japanese, without a doubt, no question, I don't care who you are, suffered more than any other POWs during the war, Bill. There's no question. It didn't matter if they were civilian, if they were Asian, of course, we had Chinese, Korean, foremost, whatever, white, Dutch, Australian, American, Brit, it didn't matter. All were treated with equal amounts of brutality and contempt. These guys just absolutely suffered, like you said just a minute ago, almost medieval-like treatment at the hands of the Japanese, who often, more often than not, and this is confirmed by survivor statements, took great pleasure in inflicting this pain, punishment, and torture on these poor, unfortunate souls. And, I want to be very clear right now, because I know for a fact, I can already read the comments. You're, perpetuating this, anti-Japanese. That's a bunch of malarkey. We're not, because we've treated the Japanese throughout almost every single one of these episodes just as fairly as we've treated our own forces. However, what people need to understand, and unfortunately, I don't think a lot of them do, is that the Japanese military during World War II was one of the most brutal militaries this world has ever seen. And that goes for their own people and the people that they were fighting against. And that needs to be understood because, to my knowledge, that information is not being taught in the country of Japan. It is being taught in China, but it is not being taught in the country of Japan. And our own country, this country, our high school students, of which my son is one, they don't know anything about this. They have no idea. They're taught like 4 different things on World War II: Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the atomic bombs, and Tuskegee Airmen. That's it. Nothing else. So people need to understand the type of military we were fighting in the Pacific. And this is why treatment like this is why some of the things were done at the end of the war and the ways in which they were done. And I think that's incredibly important that people need to wrap their mind around that, Bill.
It is, yeah. So, people go back in history to the days of the Babylonians and the Persians and the Romans and say, oh, holy cow, they killed all the women and children. And, the point we're making here is that is true. War was brutal in those days, but here we have a situation in the 20th century where the same kind of things happened. So don't think we're above it. Don't think that the humanity has evolved above it. There's still evil in the world, and it can happen in the 21st century as well. And Seth, more than 27,465 Americans were captured in the Pacific. And every one of them fell outside the protections of the Geneva Conventions in relation to prisoners of war. And that's prisoners of war. It's not counting all the civilians that were captured on all sides, right? Chinese, Indonesians, Malays, in all sides. The death rate among the POWs in the Pacific was over 40%.
Americans, 40% for the Americans.
For the Americans, right? I'm sorry. Yeah. 11,107 would not return home. The death rate of Allied POWs, including Americans under the Japanese, reached an astonishing 80 to 90%, I should say, right?
Yeah.
By contrast, the death rate of Allied POWs in Europe under the Germans was 4%. 80 to 90% versus 4%. Now, we can't compare what happened to, we can compare what happened to American POWs under Japan with what happened to Jews in concentration camps. The Jews were treated worse by the Germans in concentration camps. But the American POWs in Europe, not even close to either the Jews in concentration camps or the Allies under the Japanese. It was horrific and in a class by itself in modern times, Seth.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And then 80 to 90%, I know that's vague, but when I was writing these notes, I searched long and hard to find a concrete number, and the numbers go all over the place, like for the percentage of Allies who died as POWs at the hands of the Japanese. Of course, and I'm not making light of this, I'm being serious, the Japanese give us the smallest number, and the Americans give us the highest number, and it's somewhere in between there. And I frankly don't know. I don't know what it is, and we might never know, but it's certainly significant. It's certainly way up there, we should say. And yes, Bill, exactly to your point, the treatment at the hands of the Japanese was barbarous. No matter who happened to fall into their unfortunate grasp, treatment at the hands of the Japanese was absolutely barbarous. And this is an episode that I don't want to say we necessarily wanted to do, but we felt like we had to do. because we've been asked before to do something on POWs, and maybe this isn't the end all be all, and probably isn't, but it gives a pretty good understanding of what these guys went through, and women too, by the way, because they were also, uh, that's something we never did talk about, Bill. In the island of Hollandia, there was a comfort woman house that was discovered
Mhm.
by American troops that was staffed, I don't know what, by white women who had been, let's just suffice it to say, brutally treated by their Japanese captors. And most of these women
Yeah,
were
if you're gonna
dead by the time they were found by American soldiers. Good.
yeah, and if you're gonna talk about comfort women, you gotta talk about the Korean women who
Oh, for
were
sure.
taken out of
For sure.
Korea and were, basically forced into prostitution for Japanese soldiers and sailors, but mostly soldiers, and that they were sent all over the place. Pretty much any place there was a concentration of Japanese soldiers, there was a little village of slave Korean women. And yeah, but there wasn't only Korean women, but the vast majority of them were.
Yeah, it's that's another episode that would be very difficult to do, and I frankly have no desire to do so. To talk
No,
about
I
comfort
don't
women,
either.
I'm out on that topic. Well, Bill, it's been another enlightening, uplifting, heartwarming episode of the unauthorized history of the Pacific War. I don't know. Could we get any darker? I'm sure we could, but I think it's time to throttle back on the misery level, that we've been throwing at people these last several weeks, and take a step back. And not that we're going to do anything lighthearted, because we ain't,
No,
but as you said, the atrocity series, mini series within the series, I'm about ready for it to come to an end, my friend. I don't know about you.
I am too, Seth. It had to be, the stories had to be told, but
Indeed, indeed.
combat is, is not uplifting.
No,
But this is just so agonizing
yeah,
that I'd rather go back to the conversations about people fighting, combatants fighting each other,
yeah,
rather than combatants fighting people who can't fight back, which
yeah.
is what this atrocity series has been about.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. Is combatants fighting against people who can't fight back, who can't do anything about it. When we were talking to James last week, I said, I can talk about, and I can hear about, or read about, or write about, or whatever, you know, armies grappling and navies shooting each other to pieces, and that whole thing. I can get. I've done that my whole career, but if you involve helpless women and children into the conversation, that's where I can't do it. It's very difficult to do, and I think it's understandable as to why. So I'll be for one, we'll be very glad to get back to uh, our beloved Big Blue Fleet, as we're now going to mercifully leave the Philippines behind and move on to the Central Pacific Drive again, Bill. With next week, we're going to talk about a couple of little storms that happen to befall Admiral William Halsey. That Yeah, they're not pleasant either, but it's a different turn of events, shall we say?
Yeah, and it so happens that as we're recording this, there's a Category 5 hurricane going through the Caribbean. So
Mhm.
doing the typhoon episode next week, I hope we don't have to live through one as we're recording it.
Yeah, yeah. Same here. Same here.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and/or watching to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Please give us a rating and review wherever you receive your podcast. We do appreciate it. If you are looking at us on YouTube and you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. We do greatly appreciate that as well. Also, check out Old Salt Coffee at oldsaltcoffee.com. Give their product a chance. Use these promo code Pacific Podcast 20, or what is it? Is it Pacific? Jesus God, am I even giving the wrong information? Good Lord.
I
No,
think
I
you got
am.
it right.
It's right. Yeah, Pacific Podcast
Yeah.
20. Sorry. Sorry. Give give them a chance and use the promo code Pacific Podcast 20 on your first order and get 20% off of your order. Again, they're not a sponsor. They're just cool dudes. So give them a shot.
What,
And
what that means is we don't get anything from them for saying
not a
this. We
lick.
just like their product.
Yep, that's it. That's all there is to it. So if you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrin. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Bill, take us on.
Wear your raincoat next week because we're going to be talking about storms. See you then.